Meth from the same department as Tom, and also a member of Sheffield Institute for International Development. I'm going to give a very, very different insight into violence in African cities, because I'm largely going to be talking about violence in the home. But as Tom very helpfully set out in his introductory comments, the intersections between violence in the home and violence in the public realm are very strong and very critical to remember. So I would argue it's a key space where violence takes place, but it's not separate from the types of violence that Tom has been discussing. So, I'm sorry I've got so much writing on my slides. I realise that's really bad practice. I wanted to start off just with some gender-based violence statistics, just to give a sense of the sort of order or scale of the issues that we're talking about. And I think Tom's opening slide was very effective at setting that scene. But essentially, if you look at rates of intimate partner violence as well as rates of non-partner sexual violence, in sub-Saharan Africa, and if you look at the southern African statistics, then the rates are initially, for the top statistic, 29.67, which where the southern part of sub-Saharan Africa is the 7th worst in the world. And then in terms of non-partner sexual violence, 17.41, a rate of 17.41, which is the second highest in the world. And the worst part of the world is central sub-Saharan Africa. So this clearly is an African issue that we should be thinking about. In relation to the South African context specifically, I always refer to Rachel Dukes' work. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it, but it's excellent ongoing research looking at gender-based violence in South Africa, but her statistics are always highly depressing. But I've just listed a few relevant ones there. So just some dates, some of it's a bit old, from 1999, 3,800 female homicides, 6 times higher than the global average in the South African context. 28% of men that they've interviewed in huge national surveys admit to having carried out rape. That's a third of men, nearly a third, in South Africa. Men are also rape victims. Very hard to get men to talk about it, but there is evidence of men as rape victims as well, about 1 in 30 men. And then also to bear in mind, and this relates to Tom's earlier point, the rate of violent death for men in South Africa, 8 times the global average. So when we talk about gendered experiences of violence, it's critical to remember both men and women's experiences. So obviously what I'm arguing, and I think what we probably would all agree, is that this kind of crisis requires a multidisciplinary response. Now my talk is going to be giving a kind of perspective from geography, which you might question and argue is a bit naff, because I think often the work that we see from criminology, from law, from politics, is often a bit more hard-hitting in terms of what it's focusing on, and perhaps more obviously tied to policy. But I hope what I'm going to talk about is interesting at the very least for you. So I'm arguing here that home is overlooked quite often. So home is a really important space where we need to think about violence. And obviously, as Tom suggested earlier, violence in cities is both taking place in public and private spaces. When we look at gender violence and we look at stories and statistical accounts of gender violence, it occurs in multiple public spaces. I'm sure lots of you have seen reports in the media recently about violence in relation to toilets, public toilets, and toilet spaces across poor cities. But certainly in my research, men and women talk about the bush as being a critical place where violence occurs, as well as the streets, and what I'm going to talk about, the home. Now this is directly linked to the types of infrastructure that we see in these urban spaces, whether these spaces have lighting, the quality of the policing and the policing networks and the relationships between the police and residents, but also the density of the settlements. All those factors affect the way in which gender violence is experienced. So I'm focusing on the experience of violence in the home, and I'm drawing on a range of different projects that I've been involved with since 2002 and up until now, which have been looking at questions of men and women's experiences of violence. And initially I was focusing on their experiences directly related to those living in informal settlements, so people living in squatter housing in the South African context. And my recent research is trying to look at experiences of violence in settlements which have just been upgraded by the state. So some of you may be aware that the South African government has this huge flagship housing program. They have to date built 3 million houses, 3 million formal houses. And I'm looking at the ways in which this shift to formal housing, living in a so-called proper or decent house, is what the state calls it, what impact that's having on experiences of violence, both public violence on the streets and in the neighborhoods, as well as gender violence. The state is trying to convince itself that living in a decent house will reduce crime and reduce violence generally. So my work is trying to explore that. It's not working, but I can carry on until something happens. So there's just three findings I want to draw your attention to. The first one is just to talk about domestic violence and just to think about how we might respond to domestic violence in contexts of informality, so in informal housing. And then the second one is to make the claim that when we talk about gender violence, we really are in danger of overlooking men's experiences of violence. So we need to take men's experiences into account as well. And then finally, to question the ways in which we are upgrading housing. And it's not just happening in South Africa, it's happening in other African cities too. And looking at the impact of changing housing in cities and what impact that's having on gender violence. So those are the three things I want to focus on. So quite some time ago, when I was looking at domestic violence in squatter settlements, I made what may seem like a very simple argument that literature across the world that looks at gender violence and domestic violence really struggles to think about domestic violence in squatter housing. So when people talk about domestic violence, they often imagine a formal house where somebody can lock the door, where somebody has a separate bedroom, where people have potential access to an asset, they may own the property. I argue that all those factors shape how a woman, it's usually a woman, but not always, how she can deal with domestic violence. So when you're living in a squatter settlement, your ability to respond to domestic violence, I would argue, is very different. The other issue is that we all know that when people talk about domestic violence in cities, the response is usually, well, we'll provide a shelter or refuge for the victim and her children. But if you're sitting, that response is a very Western response because it assumes that the government has the capacity to provide housing in the first place. If they can provide refuges, well, then they can provide housing. But we know that across most African cities, vast numbers of the population are living in shacks. So there's absolutely no facility for victims of domestic violence who are living in squatter camps. They don't get access to domestic violence refuges. Those refuges are for women who come from proper homes, from formal homes. And through research with refuges, they've agreed that they can't provide for women from squatter camps. They don't provide for that level of poverty. So there's a real disconnection between thinking about how to deal with domestic violence of poorer urban residents. Well, I would argue in many cases the majority of urban residents. So that's the one issue. The second one is around us failing to take men's experiences of violence into account. Men's experiences, both as perpetrators and victims, need to be researched more fully, and men are often both at the same time. They will often admit to being both perpetrator and victim. And that's in relation to the type of violence that Tom was talking about. So they might be perpetrators of domestic violence in the home space, but they may also be victims of generic street or public violence outside of the home. Because I'm interested in masculinity research and feminist geography, I would argue that we really need to make sense of what's going on if we want to try and understand the sort of social issues informing everything that Tom was talking about. We need to understand what's actually happening. I would argue that cities are spaces where men suffer enormously emotionally. In some research where I've used diary writing, which is like story writing with men, they've talked about their stress and trauma and devastation of living in both in poverty, but also in relation to the high levels of violence in cities. And I'll just read out this one quote, which unfortunately you can't see, but this is a man, Bongani, from Durban in South Africa, saying, "There are cases of when the criminals enter your house, they sleep with your wife, in other words, they rape her, in front of you, and also your children. I don't know if I can survive under that situation as head of household. The family cannot trust that they are protected if they're with you. As a man, you've lost your dignity. No one can respect you as a man." So we think just trying to get you to think through the consequences for men as well of these very high levels of rape that we talk about in the South African context. The third and final argument I wanted to visit was just this issue of housing upgrading and formalization. And I think it's an important one because from a policy perspective, certainly South Africa, along with other wealthier nations, are pursuing the provision of urban housing as a core urban strategy. It's an important urban policy. And the state, as I said earlier, is making claims that providing decent housing will impact very positively on the social relations, the community and the social experiences of residents. And I think in many respects this is true. So in work that myself and colleagues from Cape Town, Durban and Johannesburg have been doing in South Africa, there are lots of positive gains of this housing program. So people talk about gains in security, reductions in crime, although actually I think the crime reductions actually relates to the decrease in density of the settlement, so that's another issue. They talk about positive shifts in their own identity. They talk about how people used to describe their ways of living as though they were living like animals, and now they feel like they're proper citizens. They have space, and they obviously have safe shelter, so it's not raining inside their shack. All those things are critically positive gains. And I think some of those gains are showing evidence that they can reduce the tensions that did in the past lead to domestic violence. So women tell us stories about how her husband can now bath in private in a separate room, and he's less angry. The children can do homework in the kitchen, and so the partner's less angry when he comes home. So the kinds of petty household dynamics that led to violence in the past, we are seeing some improvements. However, from recent research that I've been doing, it does seem that upgrading housing can also foster new forms of violence and can also hide domestic violence. And I'll just finish off by just giving two examples. The first one is this issue of the tension in communities in South Africa over waiting for housing. The waiting list is huge. Many people have waited over 10 years already, and they know that they're likely to wait another 10 years. So there's a lot of tension between households and neighbours over who gets on the housing list. It's highly political, highly corrupt, and there's huge anxiety around that. The housing offer is a one-off offer from the state. You get a free house, and you just get it once in your life. You can't get it again. So women are now reporting to us in our research that male members of their family are committing violence against them because of this desperation to claim ownership of this housing asset. So it's really coming back to kind of some of the stuff Tom was talking about earlier over these tensions over urban assets. But in this case, we're seeing tensions between men and women because one pretty progressive element of the South African housing program is that it has targeted women in quite a good way because they've offered houses to people who have dependents. That's one of the criteria to access a house. So this has been very beneficial for women. But male relatives are therefore in tension with females who are gaining access to housing. And I had a quote, but I'll leave that. But I mean, this supports other research which shows that conflict arises in relation to any forms of urban development. And I would say that we need to remember that conflict can be gendered depending on the policy that's been set in place. And then the final example I'll give of how new housing might foster different forms of domestic violence or different experiences is just in relation to the materiality. And as a geographer, that's what we obsess over. So the materiality of the housing, i.e. what the house is made out of. I have lots of evidence to show that when you shift from a squatter house to a formal brick house or a concrete block house, that the response rate from neighbours who come to your aid when you're screaming and shouting and you're being beaten decreases. And this is partly to do with the fact that they can no longer hear what's happening. They can't hear it as clearly. We know that statistics for domestic violence in suburban areas across the world, America's one of the worst, is far worse in suburbia than in denser parts of the city because you have no one who can hear you. So this is an interesting issue. So women are reporting that more violence is taking place behind closed doors because neighbours can't hear them. In my previous research in squatter settlements, neighbours used to come to each other's rescue because they could hear it very clearly because the walls were made out of plastic or a sheet of metal. And so I think this is an important issue for us to remember, but it also ties into the ways in which communities want to see themselves as more decent, and they describe how they no longer wish to be concerned about things like domestic violence, because that's really just animal kind of behavior. And so they want to see themselves in a different way, and that's also leading to less assistance between households. So there's a communal and a material issue. I need to finish off down there. Okay, so my concluding comments. I think we need input to understand gender violence from a range of different disciplines. I've tried to give some insights from the field of geography to get us thinking about the spaces where violence takes place. I think I would support Tom in saying that I think interventions into employment as well as justice mechanisms are central to responding to gender violence. But we need an awareness of gender-based violence experiences and their complexities. I've tried to touch on some of those if we're to respond to this issue. Thank you.